Welcome all. Thank you for coming to Beyond Burnout on mental health and neurodiversity in engineering. I'm James. I'm a site reliability engineer, as I'm sure many of you are. I'm also an organizer at DevOps Days Boston. But before I ever got into technology, my background is actually in psychology and political science. So this is something I used to study. Before I get any further into the talk, I will just note some content warnings for this. If you're going to have difficulty hearing about mental illness, about coercive treatment, about the crisis or the legal system, I'm not going to say don't watch the talk, but you might benefit from watching the recording later or looking at the slides online, which I've already posted on Twitter, by the way. For this talk, I am here as an activist, so I'm not a mental health professional, I'm not a lawyer, and my recommendations are very US-centric because a lot of these laws will vary depending on where you are. One final housekeeping note, I'm not actually taking questions on stage, but you can find me after the talk or on Twitter and Slack, so if you want to ask questions, I'll be right outside after this. Now, my own background, being one that really comes from academic study of people, engineering is actually a great fit for that because engineering problems are usually people problems. There are all sorts of issues with competing goals or coordination on large projects. Any project that's big enough to be interesting is also big enough to really primarily be people-dominated rather than technology-dominated. And managing stress is one of those problems. I love that I work in operations because in operations, it is a best practice to reduce the burden of mental health on your job. Sure, we may have stressful jobs, but we acknowledge that it's stressful, we talk about it being stressful, and hopefully we actually implement changes to make it less stressful. And in some ways that are really relatable to a lot of people. So we talk about imposter syndrome. We talk about martyr culture. So what do we do that affects all of us, basically? These are things that we all have met someone with, have seen on our teams, maybe been affected by ourselves. So they're very relatable. Now, when we talk about mental health, we're really talking about the overall state of our system. We're not talking about any one specific problem. It's sort of like how your physical health isn't just whether you exercise or not. It might also be whether you currently have an injury, whether you have a diagnosis, a chronic condition. All of those affect health. It's a very general term. And mental health, in particular, does matter for everyone. All of us have mental health because it is such a catch-all term. But having mental health is actually a lot harder if you also have a mental disorder. And actually, about 25% of people have a mental disorder at any one time. If you look at people over their lifetime, that number actually goes up to about 50% will have some condition that could be diagnosed as a mental disorder during their life. So we're not even talking about a minority, so to speak, here. This is actually a full 50% of people in this room will, at some point in their lives, be likely to have a mental disorder. What do I mean by when I say mental disorder? Because I know not everyone has a psychology background. And really, even in psychology, some of these terms are fluid. So I'm going to be talking about the terms the way that I'm using them for this talk. When I say mental illness, I'm talking about a diagnosable set of symptoms that affects the way you think, the way you feel emotions, or the way you feel compelled to behave. So some disorders there are pretty common ones that you've heard of. You've heard of depression and anxiety. There's actually a few hundred disorders that are diagnosable to varying degrees. But there's also a lot of things that aren't mental illnesses. So I'm specifically not talking about things like burnout at your job or grief or your political views are actually explicitly not diagnosable as a mental illness. These are longer-term conditions. They're not as directly caused by a specific incident, or they don't go away when that incident is over in the way that some of these others do over time. But when I say mental disorders, I'm also talking about neurodevelopmental disorders. And these ones actually, these ones have a little bit of a different definition. Where mental illnesses are things that truly are unpleasant to live with, that give you really a potential to have a lot of suffering in your life because of them. Neurodevelopmental disorders are much more of a mixed case. They're actually classified by their etiology and sort of how you get these disorders and how they progress over your lifespan. So that might be something like a learning disorder. That might be dyslexia. It could be autism. It could be ADHD. And these tend to be, again, lifelong conditions. But they're all fit together under the umbrella of mental disorders. So to emphasize, we're not exclusively talking about people who would describe themselves as sick. So the medical model here doesn't necessarily apply because all these disorders can cause a deficit in some ability that you have, but that doesn't mean that we have to treat all of them. That doesn't mean that we have to treat them all as inherently negative. So really the neurodiversity approach to this is whether it's a mental illness or a neurodevelopmental disorder, you might want to treat symptoms of it. You may choose to be treated, but it's something we shouldn't enforce on you. And something we should value what your mind does. We should value you as a person and try and reconcile that, rather than a medical model that's like a very top-down treatment approach. Now, why am I talking about mental disorders? Well, engineering has had all kinds of struggles with diversity along many, many axes. And mental disorders are actually a much more hidden diversity problem. If you look at the statistics on mental disorders, people who are diagnosed with mental disorders have horrible statistics on their ability to get jobs, to retain jobs, to have happy lives. Not necessarily because of the nature of those disorders. A large part of it is the way that we treat them and the way that, honestly, we discriminate against them. It's actually one of the few entirely legally protected groups where discrimination is not only accepted but encouraged in mainstream representation. I don't know if you've ever seen any dating advice that tells you not to go date a crazy person or something like that. Now think of, like, would you accept that about any other group, right? These are people just like you. You may be one of these people trying to live a happy life. But it also impacts diversity because mental disorders are not evenly distributed. So when I had that slide that's like 25% of people, that does not mean that you personally have a 25% chance because, again, these aren't distributed. So diagnosis is impacted by your race. It's impacted by gender, so women tend to be diagnosed with more mental illnesses than men, but also women and men get diagnosed with different mental illnesses than each other. So some of these mental illnesses, you're like 5 times as likely to be diagnosed with it if you're a woman or a man or vice versa. Sexuality too. Queer people are something like 2 to 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness, largely due to the impact of stigma against them. So that being said, this is like kind of a gloomy presentation so far, right? But the truth is that mental health and mental disorders are actually somewhat orthogonal. It's actually possible to have a mental disorder and have a totally awesome life. You know, you could have a learning disorder, which is a mental disorder, and you could just absolutely love your job and fit in fine. Maybe you can't do expense reports because you have difficulty with numbers, but maybe that just doesn't come up that often in your job. And likewise, you can have no mental disorder to speak of, but to be in terrible mental health because your job induces it, because you're going through grief, because you just had a child and you're not getting any sleep. So again, mental health is an important concept, but we also have to talk about mental disorders specifically because while the two are related, they're not identical. That being said, there is a strong correlation. And there's all sorts of ways that mental disorders can directly harm your mental health. So these symptoms are just really unpleasant to live with. If you have intrusive thoughts, someone might hear voices because of their mental disorder. They might have panic attacks due to anxiety. These are all ways that your mental disorder, and really specifically this most applies to mental illnesses. These are the kinds of symptoms that make mental illnesses something that's much more treatment focused versus neurodevelopmental disorders. And actually, a lot of people are familiar at this point, and I think that's been a really great development over the past few decades, that stigma around mental disorders is somewhat improving. But there's all sorts of ways that that stigma affects people. So it can be very hard to make or maintain friends, to keep a job. And if you lose a job due to some kind of mental disorder, like you need to take time off to be in a hospital and to receive like intensive therapy, it's incredibly hard to disclose that during a job interview. But if you don't disclose it, you have a gap on your resume. So this is actually a form of discrimination that is just impacted by getting treatment. One thing that some people aren't aware of, if you haven't had a mental disorder yourself, is that mental disorders, treating them can actually harm your mental health. And that doesn't seem like obvious, right? You'd think it would make you get better. But it's actually incredibly time-consuming to get treatment. Treatment doesn't necessarily work, and treatment can be very stressful. Like if you've been hospitalized due to a mental disorder, you might actually wind up with PTSD, a different mental disorder from the hospitalization, because it can be so traumatic and invasive. This map is actually what I used to have to do to go get my psychiatric prescriptions. I'd have to take a ferry from Long Island, go all the way to Connecticut, camp out there for the day, come back with my prescription, and I had to do that every month. So SREs already make reliable systems from unreliable components. We just accept that that's a thing, that we should have our systems able to disappear at any time, and the overall service is still going to work. And the reality is that while mental disorders may come with a lot of negative symptoms, may occasionally be disruptive, generally speaking, the unreliability that a person has in their ability to perform their job due to a mental disorder, it's like a much smaller level of variation than the variation that just naturally exists with people who are incredibly unreliable to start with. So the question then becomes, how do we care for engineers with mental disorders? I don't know if anyone else is a Mr. Robot fan. I love the show. And there's this stereotype that the main character of this show really fits, that engineers are just misanthropic, introverts, they hate everyone, they can't function in society, they're depressed and stressed all the time. And certainly, if that's your experience, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. But actually, according to statistics on this, engineers are doing just fine. If you look at job happiness statistics, if you look at rates of mental disorders, in all of those cases, engineering is actually better than average. If you look at the occupations that are worse than average on mental health outcomes, they're occupations that are low responsibility, low prestige, low pay, and low control. They're jobs that you don't want to work at because you have no control over your circumstances. Engineering is practically the opposite of that. It's a creative field. You have a lot of responsibility, and not everyone wants responsibility, but out of those who do, it's actually a very nice workplace. And again, this is all on average. So I know there are toxic workplaces on there, but what I'm talking about is an industry-wide trend that, in general, engineers do actually have access to much more mental health resources and are in better mental health than a lot of other fields. So while you might have a toxic workplace yourself, while you might be suffering from burnout, in general, there is no widespread mental health crisis among engineers. But there is an inclusivity problem for all of America, for Americans with mental disorders. And engineers can fix our part of it. But as it turns out, thoughts and prayers are not scalable. So awareness campaigns, they always come at the cost of something else you're not paying attention to. If you have personal experience with depression, that doesn't mean that you're actually going to be a good person to someone with autism, because that's a different disorder and you have to treat it in a different way. And ending stigma doesn't address tangible barriers. It's possible to build a system where every single person is in agreement that we should treat people better and still not actually treat them well because the system is set up in a way that it does not. So, caring a lot about people with mental disorders is not inclusive, right? Caring about people is great. You should care about people. You should always stretch the boundaries of who you're able to care for and what you're able to care about. But by itself, it's not inclusive. What's inclusive is evaluating your systems to remove exclusionary policies. You have to look at the policies that you have in place and figure out which ones are keeping people out, whether the original intention was to do so or not. Because a lot of the systems you're going to have to revisit were not intended to exclude people, but they have the practical effect of doing so. So let's not ask, how do we care for engineers with mental disorders? Let's ask, how can we make engineering workplaces more inclusive for people with mental disorders? Now, it turns out there's actually this great piece of legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I say piece of legislation is actually like a set of related legislation and legal judgments. It actually defines disability and accommodations. So these aren't like wishy-washy terms, right? When you say that you need accommodations, there's a specific legal definition and a legal requirement to match it. So if you're in this talk and you're deciding like, well, I don't care that much about that diversity thing, good news is that it doesn't matter if you care because there's legal penalties if you don't comply. So when we talk about sanity, when we talk about someone who has a mental disorder versus not, in the end, that's not a business requirement. What really matters is, can you get the job done at the end of the day? And maybe you need some accommodations to be able to get that done, but sanity is not a business requirement in and of itself. So let's talk SDLC, the software developer lifecycle. So you go through these phases when you're in a interview process, when you first apply to the job, as you start to negotiate and talk about compensation. And we're going to go hit up each one of these stages, and we're going to learn a little bit about how you can be more inclusive. This all starts with application, of course. And a lot of people miss that. They think that this process of inclusion starts like you have an employee with a mental disorder and you try to help them out and you try and do good by them. But actually it starts much earlier because it's a pipeline problem. So you've got to start all the way at the beginning with people applying to your job listings. One of the key points here is you have to identify what the essential functions of your job are. What are the functions that are actually really required to do this job, and what are the functions that you just sort of implicitly assume that people are going to be able to do? I'll give an example. If you just list all the technologies that your company uses, that's not saying anything about how much code they're going to have to write as a percentage of their day. It's not saying whether they're required to attend meetings. It doesn't say whether they're required to write documentation. It's totally possible to have a learning disability such that you are totally able to write and execute code, but have a very hard time writing documentation. So if that's part of the core job requirements, if you don't disclose that, you're really setting someone up to fail. There's a lot of ambiguity in our industry about expectations for hours worked, as well as for vacation schedules. Just be upfront about this, because the worst thing you can do to someone is not to not hire them, it's to hire them and then have to fire them because they don't match the expectations of the job. People will happily not apply to a job if it seems like a terrible fit for them, but you have to make it clear that it's going to be a terrible fit. So if someone needs a strict 40-hour work week because they just can't handle it with all the treatment that they're going through to have any more than that, just disclose that it is going to be a 40-hour work week. Or if it's a 70-hour work week, you should be honest about that. One that people who haven't had a serious or chronic issue might miss is that insurance plans are not all equal. There's some pretty bad insurance plans out there. They may not cover the type of coverage that you need. So you have to be upfront about these, that people basically are going to be deciding on these jobs in part because of what specific insurance plan that you offer. So this is an easy inclusivity win just to announce that on your job listings. And a final step you can do here is to use JobLint on all of your postings. JobLint is this really cool tool. There's a website for it as well as a CLI, so you can automate it if you want to. And what it does is it scans your job listings for inclusivity problems, for things that indicate an overly hostile workplace. So you should totally go run JobLint on your job postings. But don't just run JobLint and change everything that JobLint says, because that's missing the point. The point of JobLint isn't to tell you to use a different word. The point of JobLint is to tell you it's a problem that you use that word. You need to look into what the underlying problem is and why you chose that word in the first place. So if you say that you're looking for the best engineers, that's saying that maybe your workplace is a little more competitive than it needs to be. Is that actually reflecting it? Is that excluding people? SRE job postings can be pretty bad in this regard. So I'd actually classify it as an anti-pattern to have excessive cognitive or emotional requirements to do your job. Looking at this list of requirements, only a few of these are actually technical. A lot of them are about how you process information. They're about your personality, how you interface with people. So it's not just tech skills that make SREs hard to recruit. It's the people skills. You're requiring so many things from each individual person on the SRE team. So an important thing you can do here is to draw boundaries between what the SRE team has to provide as a service versus what each individual person on the SRE team has to provide. Because I think you'll find they're not actually all that in alignment. If you have a team of more than one person, it's fine for people to specialize. Maybe not everyone needs to be a unicorn who can get yelled at by a customer because there's an outage and politely respond with a very nicely worded letter, right? As long as you have one person on your team who can do that, you're probably fine. Interviewing is a place where you can really lose a lot of people. And by the way, when I say lose people, I'm talking about this as a pipeline problem. So there's the case of you have someone at your job who has a mental disorder. And engineering, because it has somewhat better mental health, actually doesn't exacerbate conditions as much. But there's also the case that engineering excludes people who already have mental disorders from postings. And that's one of the reasons we're able to get that better level of mental health by, it's kind of like you have to think about it as a process. You can't just optimize on outcome, because you could have great mental health rates in engineering if you just never hired anyone with a mental disorder. Obviously not what you want to do. So given that you are trying to actively hire people who have these disorders so that you can then make them more comfortable at your position, what can you do in the interviewing process? And one of these that's, I think, great in general minimize any kind of exam-based interviewing. It's very stressful, it's high pressure, sort of make and break environment, and it's not actually reflective of what most SRE positions are like on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't involve working with other people, it doesn't involve searching for resources, it doesn't involve live debugging. So like whether you can invert a tree is definitely going to stress people out and probably not going to tell you anything that interesting about the candidate. Likewise, avoid puzzles and anything else that's intended to be artificially stressful. I saw a job posting where someone was bragging about how they use Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes as an interview tool. If you haven't played it, it's a VR game where one person can see a bomb and the other people can see the instructions to disarm the bomb, and you read the instructions to them. Can you imagine how stressful that would be to have your fit for a company being evaluated by how well you play a game intended to be high stress? I myself, actually, I had an interview where the bulk of the interview was someone handing me those interlocking metal ring puzzles and expecting me to solve them. How is that inclusive to someone who maybe has a disability affecting their spatial cognition, which could make them basically impossible to solve those puzzles? That has nothing to do with your ability to write code, to operate code. Now, those are some things that are just like flat out don't do's. But one thing that's like a little more subtle that a lot of companies do is you go to an interview and you maybe talk about the interview the day of. You kind of brainstorm, oh, what questions are we going to ask? I asked them about this. Maybe you should ask them about that. And actually, this is a really insidious way that bias can sneak into interviews. If you have a person who is coming in with a mental disorder, that might make it harder for them to relate to you in some ways. That could be because they have a lot of anxiety. It could be because they aren't able to maintain eye contact. It could be that they have issues processing spoken English. So the way that human psychology works, if you find it harder to relate to someone and then you ask them open-ended questions, you won't tend to like the answers to their questions, which will lead you to ask more and more leading questions and basically disqualify them based on your initial impression. And the way you get around this is to define your interview questions in advance, have success criteria for them, and apply them consistently. So really, it's like automating the interview process. Of course, there's always some room for discretion here, but anytime you hear of like a totally open-ended interview process, just be aware, if you choose that, you are choosing to exclude people who don't do well in that kind of environment. Likewise, this should go without saying, but anytime you're evaluating on culture fit, this is a huge way to exclude people who don't fit in well in an office environment on the basis of their mental disorder. They may be able to do the job perfectly well, but maybe they just don't have the same interests as you. That should be fine, but practically speaking, I've seen so many job postings that make being a nerd who enjoys this particular style of gaming a job requirement. When really it has nothing to do with your job. It just makes it fractionally easier to fit into a team. If your team is committed to inclusivity, you will be able to absorb people with very different backgrounds, generally speaking. And one that you should really do if you're a hiring manager is anti-bias training. So psychologists have found again and again that all humans are subject to biases. In fact, biases are so pervasive that people often have negative biases about the biased groups that they themselves are part of. So this is something that everyone is subject to. So don't see it as a failing or a flaw that you need this training. It's something that you should just see as the cost of doing business to be a hiring manager. You should go through these trainings. So let's say that someone has gone through this process. They got hired. Maybe they had some difficulty during the interview, but you kind of learned a little bit more about them and how that would impact their on-the-job performance. You decided that you're going to pull the trigger, you're going to hire them. One of the first things you should do is in your info packet, just make sure you have mental health rights and resource information. This is like zero cost to do. There are plenty of resources online for this, and it just might make the difference for someone starting your job. One that's a little higher cost, but totally worth the investment, is actually to have company-specific social aids. So if someone finds it very difficult due to the nature of their disorder to socialize, like they might have symptoms that make it very hard for them to strike up a conversation or to be outgoing, even something as simple as having a seating chart can really make the difference in how they feel their first week. Think about what the experience is like for someone who is face blind, who comes into an office, an open office plan, and they get told, go talk to this person. They have no idea where that person is, what they do. That's incredibly intimidating. And of course, if they just ask someone for help, it can be easily resolved. But asking for help is itself intimidating. So being able to provide resources that someone can consult on their own time without outing themselves as having any particular set of symptoms or disorders is incredibly helpful. Something that a lot of companies don't do is post-hiring interviews. So you've hired someone, you want to bring them onto the job, but at the interview process, they were stressed out, they maybe spent several hours there, they were talking to the person who's going to be their engineering manager. And actually, that might not be the right person to talk to about needs and accommodations. You might need to set up a separate interview process. After they've thought about the position, they've had more time to compress the offer that has been made, which might include details they didn't have during the initial interview. This isn't really requiring much additional resources, but it can make a huge impact. And anytime you do make accommodations, I highly encourage you to think of them as something that should never be an exception. And what I mean by that is it's very easy to find some accommodation and say, yeah, I'm going to do that for you. I'm a good person. I want to make this company better for you. The problem is you only know about that accommodation because they asked about it. And unfortunately, most employees do not know their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act. They don't know what they can ask for. And even if they do know what they can ask for, they are not convinced when they're first meeting you that it is safe to ask for those things. So the best way to do this is actually to, anytime you have to make an accommodation, make it a formal part of company policy that that accommodation is available. Make it part of the documentation. So if someone needs to work from home because occasionally they have agoraphobia that interferes with their ability to leave the house, then just make a formal remote work policy. Describe the circumstances in which someone can remote work and the limits on that. Make it clear to everyone at the company what's acceptable and what isn't. Compensation is a really tricky one. I think there's been like a lot of discussions about compensation in engineering in general. But it really matters if you have the kind of employment history that you might end up with if you have a serious mental disorder where you have interruptions, where you might move between jobs a lot because you get to a job and you find out that they just cannot support the needs that you have. So one point here is that you really need to base salaries on objective criteria and not negotiation. Given someone's resume and given someone's like tangible set of skills, it should be very easy to accurately predict what their salary is going to be at your company. If their salary is a factor of negotiation, you are leaving out a huge chunk of people who are not capable of negotiating in the same way as others. That could be because they are stressed out in that situation and it triggers a panic attack. It could be because they're depressed and they just find it very hard to advocate for themselves. It doesn't really matter why, but just what you need to know is that negotiation itself is not a skill that you can assume. It should not be a required skill for being a software engineer. Likewise, don't base salaries on prior compensation. This compounds the effects of discrimination. If someone was discriminated against at their first job, they got a little bit lower pay because people weren't sure about them. Then the next job asked that salary, they base it off the prior one. That compounds, and you're looking at a huge lifetime deficit in earnings because of it. This is a critical issue for people. You need to compensate fairly just on the basis of what that person is bringing to the company, not on what they were doing before they came to the company. Along the same negotiation lines, set expectations in advance for yearly reviews, for bonuses. Again, don't make this a point of negotiation because anytime you're introducing negotiation to be fairly compensated, you're saying, I only want to fairly compensate you if you are a very functional person who can advocate for themselves and win. And of course, if you're a large company, many of you work at large companies, make sure they're publishing statistical reports on this. So I talked a little bit about insurance. I won't go into that in any more detail, other than to note, make sure your insurance coverage is also trans-inclusive, which a lot of companies don't explicitly check for. Unlimited vacation. There's been all sorts of debates about this one. Personally, I'm a fan of mandatory vacation as a replacement. And why would I want mandatory vacation rather than unlimited vacation? Well, because the answer is that unlimited never really is unlimited. And of course, there's a vernacular understanding that, yes, we realize it's not unlimited. But think about someone who has an anxiety disorder and is going to have to think about whether they can take a day off because they're horribly stressed that day, because they're feeling jittery. Do you really want them thinking, like, can I afford to take this day off? I've already taken a bunch of days off lately. You just need to be level with them. Let them know that there are expectations on the job for how much you're going to show up to it. Let them know that if they do have a more serious set of conditions, maybe they need to look into leave. Don't leave them guessing. It's actually less stressful to get a no response than to get an ambiguous response. Because if you have an ambiguous response, you have to think about all the possibilities, not the reality of someone saying no to you. Likewise, document how sick days impact mental health. You are required to have sick days that cover mental health, but a lot of your employees may not realize that. A lot of companies have health benefits, like just general exercise benefits. You know, if you have a physical injury, maybe they cover massage or something like that. But a lot of these benefit programs, like they won't cover massage if you need a massage for stress as a mental health treatment. So it's like the same treatment, the same cost, but they won't cover it because it's a mental health need instead of a physical health need. So if you offer a program like this, consider just making it healthcare inclusive in general, any kind of healthcare that someone needs. Because like, you know, if you have a lot of therapy appointments, even if it's covered by insurance, you might have co-pays for that. You have co-pays for your psychiatric medications. These are ways to just directly help people out and make their lives more manageable. With that being said, any of those like extra benefit programs, you can fall into a trap of requiring someone to be a professional patient, where it's so complicated that they really need to spend a lot of time figuring it out. So make sure you have someone in HR who's capable of helping them through that process. Now, it would be great if everyone got all the mental health treatment that they needed and was really satisfied with their condition. But the reality is mental health care is very primitive. We don't understand what causes most mental disorders. We don't understand how to fix them. And even if we did understand how to fix them, there would still be reasons to avoid treatment. It can be expensive, time-consuming. It can just be a mess to get treated. And the reality is most people who receive treatment are not fully cured by that treatment anyways. That's not to say you shouldn't undergo any kind of treatment, but just trying to understand where people are coming from. That just because they have a great mental health care inclusive coverage plan, they may not want to take full advantage of it because it could actually make their life worse. When it comes to job duties, you can do a lot to make your way of doing business more inclusive. So make meetings and presentations optional, record them, and in general, find alternatives to a specific mode of contribution. So adversarial decision making is like what you see in the court system, where like each side has arguments and they bring them to the table, you debate over it, and like the best side wins. There are all sorts of other ways to make decisions that are more collaborative. That's not to say the collaborative ones don't have downsides, but use multiple strategies here. Make sure that there's no set of people that is entirely locked out because of the process that you've chosen. And like I mentioned, don't expect every person on your SRE team to fulfill every duty that is required of the SRE team. That's not the way that we're supposed to deploy services nowadays, right? We don't want monoliths, we want microservices. So think about what you can do to make your team reflect your desired organizational structure. There's a lot that could be said about working conditions, but just in general, the open office plan is like one of the worst things to happen to the American worker in the last century. They're really terrible. There's like all sorts of research about how they are literally killing us. But have private offices available. If you are going to have people able to do remote work or flexible scheduling, make sure that you have a formal policy so people don't have to guess about it, because guessing is incredibly stressful. Having to negotiate for your rights is stressful. You either want to be told yes or no. This is a big one. Don't require socializing on a company's terms. You know, it's reasonable to expect that there's a certain level of sociality that you have to be in an office. You can't yell at people in an office. That's just never going to work. But you don't have to go to all the office parties. You don't have to bring your spouse. Those are not requirements that have anything to do with how good of an engineer you are. This one. If you hear someone like joking about mental disorders in an offensive way, what I want you to do is to fire that person and to make it clear why they were fired so that nobody else does it. The only exception you should make to this is from people who have mental disorders themselves and are joking about them because they're an important coping mechanism. And, you know, I realize that not everyone's into black humor, and it's not appropriate at all workplaces. So it's fine to tell someone like, you know, actually, we'd like it if you didn't joke about suicide at work, because not everyone's okay with that. And that's reasonable. It's fine to have that boundary. But the difference is you tell that to them, but you don't say, hey, I'm worried about you, are you okay? You don't say, hey, I'm going to have you committed because of that. You try and understand where they're coming from and try and figure out what's a compromise between the behavior that's self-preserving for them and what's an acceptable norm in the workplace. When it comes to training, make sure to provide your material in multiple formats, like a subscription service where people can learn on their own time. For example, if I had dyslexia, I might have difficulty with written documentation, but be totally fine learning about things in hands-on workshops or from videos. I highly recommend establishing a formal mentorship program. This can be really helpful to anyone with a mental disorder because often when you have a mental disorder, it's very hard to make that kind of initial connection with someone. And if you don't have those levels of like surface relationships, it's harder to go deeper. If you have someone who's a mentor who's committed to understanding you and where you're coming from, it makes it much easier to get past that initial difficulty that you may face in socialization and move on to the deeper issues you're facing. Things like just how do I get promoted in this company, right? Because nobody wants to deal with mental illness as their full-time conversation. It's just something that you kind of have to deal with and hopefully move on from rather than something you want to talk about all the time. If you are going to have any kind of mentorship or direct manager check-in, make sure that you're either educating your managers about mental health or you're providing other resources. Because one of the worst things you can do is like provide a check-in and have it be like mandatory to talk about mental health with someone who can't talk about mental health. In fact, when we try and talk about mental health, when we don't have a script, we often have this anti-pattern of giving extensive advice to people because we feel anxious. It's not because we think, oh, this person is so suffering, how can I help them? It's usually a self-preservation mechanism. Someone says something that to us we hadn't thought about that's disturbing to us. We don't want to think about how this person has thought of killing themselves recently. So we just try and get control of the situation. And we do control of the situation by giving people unsolicited advice. And this is actually one of the most stressful parts of having a mental disorder is people weighing in because everyone tells you the same things that you've already tried for years. All right, on promotion, the final step in this life cycle. Don't require people to exhibit increasing responsibility over time. This is actually a really common pattern that, if people don't see you moving on up in the company, they question whether you're a good fit. Some people have disorders that are severe enough that they will probably never be able to have a high-stress management sort of lifestyle. They don't want to move up in the ranks. They want a steady job that respects them. So I want you to respect those people. Make sure that you always examine whether your advancement criteria are related to ability in some way. Not everyone can go travel across the US speaking at conferences. So if you make that a key part of getting promoted in your track, that's excluding all kinds of people who just aren't capable of doing this very particular kind of work that has nothing to do with engineering more generally. In general, though, don't protect people from career-enhancing work. What I mean by that is don't protect people from themselves. Paternalism is this idea that you know what's better for other people than they do. And this is humiliating and over the long term can actually damage their skills. You can actually make them worse at their job by trying to insulate them from things on the job. Instead, I want you to think about consent culture. Consent is something that we talk about in medical cases a lot. Basically, the idea that people should be fully informed, they should get a chance to negotiate, and they should ultimately decide what happens to them. Now, a final note on crisis. Of course, it's incredibly stressful if someone has a mental breakdown at work. It happens. Living in America, I think what you have to say here is, if you call the police on someone who is experiencing mental distress, there is a very real chance that they will end up dead because of that. So, of course, you always have to respect what's right for the company. You have to think about all your other employees. But I want you to consider that's the ultimate solution. That's what you do when someone else's life is in danger, because calling the police on someone is itself something that is putting their life in danger. In general, just try and keep this principle in mind, to always value consent and autonomy, even when it's not convenient to do so. And that's how you be respectful of people with mental disorders. The good news is we see a lot of benefits if we all become inclusive. We see this helping remote workers, we see it helping people going through grief, and we see it helping you. So even if you don't have anyone on your team right now with a mental disorder that you know of, because remember, most of them are closeted about it, this is still something you can implement today. So next steps, get your boss to watch this talk, apply recursively. I recommend open sourcing mental illnesses books. They have 3 books, one for managers, one for HR, and one for employees with mental disorders. Let's build inclusive systems together. All right, I have some links on here. The slides are available online. But thank you all, and you can find me later. I'm not taking questions right now, but I'll be in the hall afterwards. Thank you all so much.